Now, while we've been focusing on political events here at home, there have been a number of developments on the continent this week. Now, these include the unfortunate revolts which took the lives of 6 people in Kenya, and those revolts were due to public outpouring of anger over tax increases. Now, Kenya's President William Ruto said that the reason for raising taxes is for the country to meet its debt obligation, but the government has since withdrawn the proposed finance bill. Also in the news this week is the death of 2 South African National Defence Force captains who were killed during an attack on the base of the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, Professor Everisto Benyera from UNISA joins us virtually to cover some of the events taking place on the continent over the last couple of days and weeks. And some of the stories that we are going to focus on will include others as well, with regard to Zambia calling for the AU's intervention and other stories. But Professor, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you for having me, Sakin, and good morning to you and to the viewers.
And perhaps we can start with, I guess, the most burning issue right now, what's happening in Kenya, the unrest, which has attracted much coverage as one of the biggest stories of the week, culminating, unfortunately, in the death of protesters. But if we look at what's happening there, Professor, people protesting against potential tax increases, which government says it has to levy on the population so that it can manage its debt. So let's talk about your perspective on that, Professor. Is it justified, and also how things played out?
Thank you, Sakina. As events were unfolding in Kenya, people were already speculating whether this is another Arab Spring in the making. And what we can decipher is that the finance bill was actually a trigger to deep-rooted structural issues in the Kenyan economy. This, for others, was actually no longer about the finance bill alone, but about the rejection of William Ruto and his ideology. And we also see from this uprising the effectiveness of organic leaderless uprising and how they are very different for governments to deal with as groups instead of addressing the real challenges which the people would be pointing to. In this case, the rising in the cost of basic necessities such as fuel, cooking oil, and diapers. The challenge that President William Ruto had with this whole fiasco was that instead of talking to Kenyans, President Ruto was, instead of talking to Kenyans, instead of talking with them, he was talking to them. And he maintained a sort of a hardline stance, which was very unproductive, especially branding those people that were demonstrating as treasoners. This did not help, and he had eventually to climb down, because the question that then arose is, was it political naivety or it was a deliberate misleading of voters by making obvious unattainable goals? Remember, Ruto got into office through making a lot of pro-poor electoral promises, and people are now demanding that. They are saying, Mr. President, you promised this one, and what we are getting is the exact opposite. So this was bound to happen, given that Kenya, like many African countries, is in a fiscus bind.
And speaking of, so we saw President Ruto justifying the increases. He was saying that this was necessary in order to pay the country's debt. And I want us to just focus on Kenya's debt for a moment, Professor, because this is important, because this is essentially a microcosm of what's happening in other countries as well. So if we look at the debt to GDP ratio, the fact that 61 out of every 100 Kenyan shillings goes towards servicing debt. The alarm bells have been sounding for a long time that Kenya's debt levels are unsustainable.
I think the problem is the challenges that are faced by the modernization agenda as a way to bring about development in the post-colony. There are very few countries that developed on the back of borrowing, especially from international finance organizations such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, primarily because the conditionalities that are attached to those loans and so-called grants are actually not pro-poor, they are not pro-Africa, they are actually pro-market. So they basically tear up African markets, and they sort of obliterate all the welfare programs that African countries would be having. A debt to GDP ratio of 61% is unsustainable. Many African countries are in that bracket, and it is just a matter of time before what happened in Kenya can happen in most of African countries. In Malawi, it is even higher than that, and there are no concrete plans to lower the debt and to stop borrowing in future. On the contrary, what is happening is more borrowing, either domestically or internationally, in order to finance this debt. At the end of the day, Sakina, borrowing from these multilateral financial institutions in order to fund government expenditure will never be a good option. It is better to do what William Ruto eventually proposed to do when he sort of climbed down and said, let's remove this finance bill. Rather, let's focus on austerity measures. Let's address leakages in the system, especially corruption and executive impunity as a starting point. The question is, why did he not go there in the first place, Sakina?
Indeed, that is the million-dollar question. But I also just want to touch on what you said about borrowing from finance institutions that cripple African countries. You mentioned specifically the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which are your Bretton Woods institutions. But it's not just them at this stage. There's also debt to China. And all of this is adding up, especially if you look at the dollar-denominated debt that Kenya has, Professor.
Sakina, if we want to complicate it a little bit, we can actually make the analysis this way. When African countries transitioned from political colonization through the processes of decolonization, the empire did not give up. Instead, what the empire did was to mutate into something different. It mutated from a political empire to an economic empire. So the background where everything is happening in the world is a capitalist world economy. And what happens in capitalism is that the mantra is profit. The IMF and the World Bank are institutions with shareholders, of which the United States is one of the biggest shareholders. And what any shareholder demands is return on their investments, which is they need profit. And how do they profit? They profit from Africa's debt. So whether you look east to China, whether you look west to the United States and its allies, the only difference is in the austerity. The only difference is in the quantity and quality of the losses that that Africa accrues in the process of these transactions. There is already scholarship coming up that is arguing that the economy will not end at an economic empire. It will transition again into an epistemic and cognitive empire. But that is a debate for another day. What we need as Africa is economic, cognitive, and epistemic independence, because borrowing from one institution to pay the other, whether we are borrowing domestically, we then crowd out money that is meant to be used for domestic purposes. It is then borrowed by the government. If we borrow from these multilateral institutions together with the ratings that we are given by the international rating agencies, such as Moody's, such as S&P, you see that Africa is exerting minimum influence and suffering maximum consequences in this capitalist world order that we are living in, Sakina.
Prof, I want to shift focus now to the DRC, where two South African National Defence Force captains were killed, and the deaths of these latest deaths of the two captains this week, marking the fourth deadly incident for South African troops in a space of 5 months. So let's talk about that, given that there was some pushback and outcry when South Africa first deployed these troops to the DRC as the United Nations were withdrawing.
It is very sad, Sakina, and condolences to the families of the two fallen captains that that lost their lives in the DRC. What is happening in the DRC today, Sakina, is that the conflict is not getting better. The conflict is even getting more and more complicated. Just this year alone, we have had another entry which is called the Wazalendo and the Mazembe Mai Mai groups. These are sort of self-defense groups that were allowed by President Felix Tshisekedi to join and support the FARDC, which is the official Congolese army, in what they are terming self-defense. So you then add another complex layer of the Burundi National Defense Force and another force that is mainly affiliated to the Hutu rebels that were involved in the 1994 genocide. The complexity becomes even more multi-layered, because on the other side, the M23 is there. There is also something called the Twiranero, which is a Southern Kivu-based army group that is also there ostensibly to defend the Congolese Tutsis. Now, in this confusion enters South Africa. Our defense budget is less than 2% of GDP, which is the global standard. What this means is that our men and women are getting into a very complex, hostile environment without the right equipment, without the right tools of the job, so to speak. So with the complexity that I've just painted, South Africa needs not just better strategic communication, especially where it scores success, so that we do not only get news from the DRC when our men and women fall, but we also get news when they succeed. But most importantly, Sakina, what those soldiers need are helicopters, they need combat aircrafts. Otherwise, South African National Defense Force needs to bolster its defense capabilities, because we are reliably informed that the unit is under-equipped, which is also affecting its effectiveness in the DRC. But that conflict is not going to end, because at the end of the day, a political conflict can never be solved militarily, Sakina.
So from there, still in the SADC region, Zambia, and calling for the intervention of the AU and SADC. Now, this is a whole story involving weapons supply. There's Zimbabwe on the one side, Zambia on the other side. What do you know about this story, Professor, and, you know, the veracity of the allegations that are being made?
The story of the brewing conflict between Zambia and Zimbabwe, two real twins joined at the hip by colonialism, is as clear as mud. The question that is at the lips of many is the United States setting up a military base in Zambia? What we know for a fact is that the United States of America and Zambia were involved in a sort of joint operation. It was a cyber operation that was led by the United States Cyber Command National Force. And this was the first ever defense cyber deployment to Zambia. And to the best of my knowledge, it was the first such deployment by the United States to our region. And the idea was that the Americans are saying they are bringing back strengthened collaborative ties with Zambia. But that is worrying to Zimbabwe because the scale at which this collaborative exercise was done was such that it was even led by a Major General of the United States Air Force, whose name is Claude Trudeau. So Zimbabwe is right in being frightened by this intelligence-driven exercise that is happening at its borders, and its relationships with Zambia are not at its best since President Hakainde Hichilema came into power. Sakina, you are aware that regional politics is running along the lines of slats. So President Hakainde Hichilema is on the same slate with our own Musi Maimane and with Nelson Chamisa in Zimbabwe. And President Emerson Mnangagwa is on the same slate with former President Edgar Lungu, and they are even personal friends. So when Hakainde Hichilema defeated President Edgar Lungu, it felt like a personal defeat to President Emerson Mnangagwa, such that when this exercise happened, and then President Emerson Mnangagwa attended the St. Petersburg International Conference Forum, he took an opportunity when he met President Vladimir Putin to directly complain and accuse the United States of deploying military and economic ties with Zambia as a way of isolating Zimbabwe. And in that breath, President Emerson Mnangagwa then invited Russia to come and help it, specifically with food security and defense security. And Zambia is correct to be worried by the posture that Zimbabwe is taking, but Zimbabwe is equally pointing to Zambia and saying, you are the one who started this. In this region, we have got this habit of covering for each other. How could you go to the United States and have such a military cyber security exercise without not informing us, but without taking our sensitivities into your confidence? So the region, Sakina, is changing. South Africa is no longer run by the African National Congress alone. That alone will structurally change the politics of the region. And we are beginning to see a departure from this cozy relationship, which actually was marked when former Deputy President Nevas Mumba, who headed the SADC election observer mission to Zambia, said that the Zimbabwe elections that elected Emerson Mnangagwa in 2023 were structurally flawed and they were not credible. So a lot has been brewing, but what we are seeing are the faint redrawing of Cold War lines in the region. Remember Quito Carnival. Here we are again. Zambia aligning itself with the United States. Zimbabwe aligning itself with the Russian Federation. This is indeed worrying because regional politics in Southern Africa is taking a very surprising turn, especially given that the liberation movement, after 30 years in power, tends to behave in a way that is highly unpredictable, Sakina.
Well, we could talk for hours, but unfortunately we don't have that luxury. Professor Everisto Benyera, thank you so much for just outlining for us, unpacking for us the complexities of some of the developments on the continent. Professor Benyera is from the University of South Africa, UNISA, weighing in on some of the stories making headlines this week. And that brings us up to 8 o'clock. Here's Leanne with your latest news.